Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Gorenstein, and we are here to begin this this panel discussion. I am the host of the Health Policy Podcast Trade-Offs, and I am joined by a great group of folks here who I'd ask to have them turn on their screens and join us for the panel presentation and introduce themselves. And perhaps we can begin with Mikki Nasch.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mikki Nasch. I'm one of the co-founders at Evidation Health and very much looking forward to today's panel.
Ray?
Hi, my name is Ray Dorsey. I'm a neurologist at the University of Rochester and the editor of the journal Digital Biomarkers. So delighted to be with you.
Diane.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Stephenson. I'm the executive director of the Critical Path for Parkinson's Consortium at Critical Path Institute in Tucson, Arizona.
And Ronenn, please.
Hi, Ronenn Roubenoff. I'm a rheumatologist at Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research in Basel, Switzerland.
So today's panel is, we're going to have a great conversation here. We know we've got some really very knowledgeable people who are at the cutting edge of digital health. And we really want to understand the future, which is sort of now, and we want to understand what is happening in this space, and we want to explore what is it going to take to begin to have more impact, to have digital health make its way throughout the system, to be accepted by regulators, to be embraced by providers, and to be needed by patients. And so to kick things off, we're going to start with a question for Mikki. Mikki, there's this sense of the future is now, it's already happening. And it seems to me that the creation of Evidation is an example of that. Could you share the anecdote of how Evidation came into being to help give people some context, please?
Yeah, sure. I think when you're thinking about sort of the digital continuum, most other industries had already sort of embraced digital because it's not as complex as the healthcare industry. And one of the things that happened sort of at the beginning of the last decade was there was this sudden impetus to actually really understand what was going on at the patient. You saw all of the institutions really moving. You saw some shifts in healthcare regulations in the United States. And one of the most interesting things when you come from a different industry is the jarring moment when you come in contact with the healthcare system is that moment when you realize that in outside worlds, regardless of whether you work in financial or any of the other regulated industries, nobody would make a mistake when speaking to an individual. A lot of care and time is taken to make sure we have right message, right place, right time. And you get to this healthcare continuum and you realize it's exactly the same message for everybody, regardless of character or likes or dislikes. And there's absolutely no care about right message, right place, right time. There's just sort of the same message across the entire board. And when we looked at this problem, we thought this was just a perfect opportunity to really sort of engage on the digital realm to start collecting data and start collecting an understanding so that you could model people's character and their actual disease lived experience, and then start doing some of those, what I'll call consumer marketing smarts, and bringing those to the healthcare challenge. So really trying to change the way that people engage with a patient and bringing the patient to the fore so we can actually understand what matters to them.
Thanks for that. And Ray, when Mikki talks about changing the way that we engage with the patient, what's an example that leaps to your mind that that is actually happening right now?
Well, one great example is one from Evidation, in which they were able to measure activity of individuals in response to the public health emergency. And they quickly were able to determine that activity among individuals throughout the United States, thousands of individuals, increased by about 40%. And they did that in practically real time. Previously, it'd be inconceivable to be able to do such research that fastly and probably that inexpensively, but they were able to do it. The missed opportunity there is that we should have taken that opportunity, and we should do it today, is increase physical activity among everyone, all Americans and people around the world, so we decrease our risk of being hospitalized with COVID. We can now measure activity for people throughout the country and likely throughout the world. We should take that opportunity to increase activity among those individuals so we can prevent ourselves from being hospitalized due to COVID and improve our public health.
And this may be sort of a silly question, but can you explain why is it important, and what really, as a physician, what is the value in being able to understand physical activity? Why is that helpful?
Well, so if you look at New York City, 75% of people hospitalized with COVID either had diabetes, hypertension, or obesity. Almost all of that is preventable. A huge modifiable risk factor for that is physical activity. You know, why isn't Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jane Fonda doing exercise videos for everyone around the country to get us all fit and active, whether we're in home in Rochester, New York, where it's snowing outside, or hanging out in Tucson, Arizona, where it's probably 70 and sunny? We're just missing huge opportunities. We have the tools, we have the technology. We just need to develop the will to bring these things to bear.
And so help me sync this up a little bit more. So if the technology is there, and if things could have gone the way you would have ideally liked to have gone, and so Evidation is measuring people's physical activity, and there were no barriers, what would have happened beginning in the spring of 2020?
So could Evidation have pushed out an exercise video for all the people whose exercises has decreased? Could they have formed a community of people, either by age, by sex, by geography, by any number of different factors, to form virtual communities that engage in exercise? Could they have connected them to Arnold Schwarzenegger if they wanted to pump themselves up, or could they have connected them to Jane Fonda if they wanted to do yoga, or any number of different things that could be done? There's a lot of things that we can be doing to improve our public health, to decrease our risk of getting COVID, decrease our risk of getting complications of COVID, and quite simply, we're not doing it.
Thank you for that. Ronenn, I'd like to turn to you now. In your mind, you know, this idea that the future is now. When you hear that phrase, thinking about digital health, what's the first image that jumps into your mind?
So, you know, in my neck of the woods, the people who try to make new drugs, our biggest problem is 90+% failure, right? If from the time a drug gets into humans till you find out whether it's going to succeed and get registered, 90% of drugs fail. If you go from the preclinical model, it's 99%. So part of the problem for us is we have to build the measurements for seeing whether a drug is working along with the molecules. And the digital future is part of how to enable that, how to create new ways of measuring success. How do you prove that a drug made somebody better? Well, usually we have a couple of ways. They live or die. We ask them and we get their subjective response, or we measure something about their behavior. And right now we have to bring people into a hospital or a clinic and put them in front of a doctor or nurse or technician who measures those activities. We can do that at home with digital wearables, with apps, with things on smartphones. It's much richer data. It's much more valid because it's what's happening in people's lives and not in a clinic in half an hour, you know, once every month or two. So that's a big piece for us. You can imagine, you can see, for example, in Israel with a vaccination, when everyone gets a vaccine, and they've got what, half the population now vaccinated, they get a barcode and an app, and within 48 hours, they are asked on their app, how do you feel? Did you get sore? Did you get fever? Did you get headache? All these things are immediately collected. You don't have to wait till you come back for your second shot a month later and try to remember, were you achy and for how long? 3 weeks ago.
And so part of your answer was describing the challenge or the problem that drug companies have, the need that they have. are drug makers actually trying to address this? Are they utilizing digital health? What is when you think about the future being an example, is your Israel example what you're imagining, or are there others?
I think there are many others. I can tell you, you know, at Novartis, we've gone from a standing start to now having 1,500 people working on digital issues for the company. Over the last few years, we have actually digitized all of the data we've had from the last 20 years. So we have data on 1 million patients and 3,800 clinical trials now available to every researcher in the company. And over the next year, what we're rolling out are apps to allow them to interrogate those data. You know, that was just sitting in files someplace, right? It was used for one particular purpose and then filed away. But what if we could use that information to ask about unintended issues or new questions that have come up as the biology changes? For example, we do a study on heart failure, but a lot of those patients, as Ray said, they're diabetic, they're obese. What happened to them on those aspects? That was never queried before. Now somebody can sit at their laptop and figure that out.
And is that leading to improved health?
Well, we hope so. That's still the challenge. I think that's the future part of your question, right? But it wasn't feasible 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think the one thing when you're looking at the research side of the realm, the heterogeneity of the diseases that are now trying to be solved for, when you're looking at the pharmaceutical companies, there are 26 ways to get to one particular diagnosis. So just the ability to collect all of this data, both person-generated health data, which is what we focus on, and the sort of historical clinical data, and putting those data sets together, they're going to answer questions that are going to clarify exactly what the diagnosis is. We're not going to have 5 years, 5 specialists to get to a diagnosis for some of the diseases that we have. So I think when you're looking at it from a research angle, it's going to help researchers build better product and prove better outcomes. But it's in the long run, what it's going to do is shape clinical practice in a really smart way that will help get people diagnosed faster. So I think when we're looking at some of these things, they don't necessarily feel connected, but they absolutely are connected directly to the patient, because the smarter we get about what's going on with you, the better we get to help care, because we can influence clinical practice to actually get the right diagnosis within a reasonable time frame and get you on the right medication, as opposed to what we do now, which is somewhat experimental, I think, on the human side.
No, absolutely. I think you can see this over and over again, where you know, as drugs get developed and technologies come with them. Osteoporosis is a nice example, right? When there were no treatments for osteoporosis, it was kind of an interesting academic problem. As soon as therapeutics came out, so did the ways of applying the diagnostics in the clinic. So you could get a DEXA scan at every hospital, right, which didn't exist, you know, 5 years before the first drug came out. These are the kinds of things we're seeing. The other thing is flipping the whole research paradigm on its head. Today, companies like mine, the sponsors, go to doctors and ask them to find patients. That's backwards. We should be going to the patients and ask them to find doctors. And you can do that with this kind of distributed capabilities. The next generation of clinical trials will be very different from what we've been doing for the last 50 years.
Ray, I saw you clapping. I'm sure our audience saw you clapping. Why are you clapping?
Ronen's right, we have it backwards. We should be designing studies around the needs of participants, not the needs of investigators and sites. And so if you go directly to participants, or most people want to participate in research. Most people with cancer, most people with Parkinson's disease, most people with Alzheimer's disease are very eager to help contribute to getting new treatments. And the current way is we rely only on reaching those individuals who happen to go to usually an academic research site to receive care. That excludes the vast majority of people, leads to disparities in research and in care. We should be enabling tools to enable to go directly to patients, consumers, individuals with these diseases, and let them engage in research on their terms. And if that means they need to go to a research site, fantastic. If it means that they can do it without ever needing to set foot in the research site, even better.
And Diane, let me have you jump into this conversation as well from a patient perspective. And let's just stick first with this idea of the future is now. As you think about what has happened during COVID, is there any example that comes to your mind of patients benefiting from being able to send their information, their health information, directly to their providers?
Absolutely. I'm so glad to comment on this topic that Ronenn and Ray were just saying. It's actually the FDA that really catalyzed this initiative around patient-focused drug development in the last 5 years. And in COVID, that's really ramped up. So our Critical Path for Parkinson's Consortium has 7 nonprofit charity groups, but it's really the patients that are inspiring and guiding us the right way. We interact with people with Parkinson's, and they tell us the urgency is so important. This is the fastest growing brain disease. The unintended consequence of COVID is that the regulatory agencies are open. These studies are going to go on halt if we don't accept remote monitoring to reach patients. But anecdotal stories and real people with Parkinson's are telling me. One story is John Crawford, an amazing person in San Diego. He's a biotech exec. He's a hiker. He's hiked 250 miles. That's how he found out he had Parkinson's. And he came to me and said, I've developed my own app that's helping me manage my own disease every day in my life. How can you help us get this to the finish line? Because we all need this, especially during COVID. So these people living with this disease have a huge sense of urgency. We have a ways to go. We need to share information, collaborate to overcome the barriers together.
And thank you for that, Diane. Is there, did you hear from anybody who has Parkinson's in the last, 9-10 months or so to say to you how happy and relieved they are that their data is going to their provider?
Absolutely. In fact, the Critical Path for Parkinson's Consortium has brought together patient-level data from over 12,000 people with Parkinson's, many from failed trials. But people are coming to me as soon as they heard about what we're doing with support from FDA and EMA to say, how can we give you our data? How can you learn from what our experience with this disease is? Because we're not the same as this other person, and we want to be in trials, and we could potentially be in trials if we could do it in a way where we wouldn't have to travel to a site far away, or that this remote monitoring can help tell and inform physicians and trialists that how we're doing in our own home living with this disease. And I have to say, it's incredibly sad to see the devastating impact of this disease on people living with this, with brain disorders, especially Parkinson's. It's really set people back. And I think it's the unrecognized hidden pandemic is people with Parkinson's struggling on how to sustain their lives in this challenging environment.
And so to sort of speak, you bring up this idea about urgency right now from the patient perspective. The fact that it is harder to get around during COVID, it's more dangerous. Have people's health suffered as a result of their inability to access their doctors, their specialists in this moment?
That's probably a better question for Ray to answer because he sees patients both remotely and in person. Ray?
So if you look at reports that have come out, people are reporting subjective worsening of their symptoms. One study we've done is actually with a smartphone application to measure people's motor function. How fast can they tap on the smartphone as a measure of their motor function. There, for small numbers of individuals, it suggested that there wasn't a significant change. But I think if you look at the overall health of the United States or the world, it's down. I mean, how can it not be? And those individuals who have least access to care, who are most at risk for getting infected by COVID-19, or the most comorbidities, are all disproportionately adversely affected.
And Ray, if people had better access in this moment, are you pretty clear that their health would be better?
Well, yes. I mean, so doctors make some difference in people's health, and nurses make some difference in people's health. by far not the primary determinant of people's health. But most people in the United States, most people in the world get too little care. And COVID-19's only made that care less accessible. One of the silver linings of this has been the rapid adoption of telemedicine, a 100-fold increase in telemedicine among Medicare beneficiaries, which has allowed people to access care that they otherwise would simply not be able to receive, or would only be able to receive by exposing themselves to the risks of COVID-19, in which cases sometimes it might be even worse than receiving the care. So I think that's one silver lining. That change in the United States is temporary, and we need to make sure that that change is permanent, so that in a COVID-free world, ideally, anyone, anywhere can access the care that they need. We have supercomputers around it that we carry around with us everywhere that we go. We can use these supercomputers to measure our health. We can use these supercomputers to engage in clinical research, and we can use these supercomputers to receive care regardless of who we are or where we live, with some notable exceptions.
Mikki, what are next steps that need to be taken to begin to see more of this technology spread?
I think the first thing to think about when you're talking about the what ifs that we've just went through is like what do we know? If you look at what we were able to do at Evidation when we looked at like mass market surveillance of like what's going on, what people are doing, and we were able to see sort of the changes in behavior, the changes in activities. We did a couple of other sort of sub cohorts. Let's look at the people that have chronic diseases and how are they doing. So if we look at it, when you think about the impact of COVID on health in general, and we can extrapolate to global, once you're after 250,000 people, we're pretty sure that this is not going to be sort of one little unit. And the thing that we started seeing is people that have, for instance, rheumatoid arthritis, they didn't go seek care. They were worried about themselves being exposed, so they didn't go for their infusions, but they were still having exacerbations. That's permanent damage. So, you know, next year, those people are going to be worse off because this year they didn't seek care. And so I think when we're thinking about what has to happen, that generally has to happen in this world is we have to accept that this data are actually valuable. It can tell us what's going on. Sort of the biggest friction points that we get are this clinging to what I'm going to call old measures. They're not necessarily that old, but these measures of, well, it's not as exact as this measure that I have, that's a biological measure, even when we're able to show parallels. So there's a general shift that has to happen, that the measures generated by the digital realm that people themselves actually generate are better indicators of overall health and wellness and overall disease progression. That change has to happen. That adoption must take place because we need to scale. We need to scale research. We have to get better measures. We don't want people doing technician-driven 6-minute walk tests and all those things, because there's much better measures available just with cheap consumer wearables. So I think those are the things that need to take place. There has to be acceptance that the post-COVID era, we have to learn from what we actually understood during this period and really embrace it and try not to snap back to the way we used to do things. Be a little more open to different measures, and most importantly, just start measuring what matters to patients, because that's really going to be where the shift in healthcare can happen.
When you talk about this general shift, this is very interesting to me. When you talk about it, are you talking about providers sort of shifting at how they think about measures? Or who is it, regulators? Who needs to do this sort of shift that you're talking about?
Yeah, in this case, I think the regulators are a little ahead of the providers, to be honest, of the sort of research and provider world. So when you look at the way that the FDA has been pushing towards trying to embrace all of the new measures for health and saying, you know, let's measure what matters to patients. Let's do patient-centered trial design. So I think that the regulators themselves are a little ahead. They're waiting for the market itself to shift. So when we think about it, it's a little difficult because some of this needs to be non-competitive consortia for replacing measures like the 6-minute walk tests. And so there has to be an energy where everybody gets together and say, let's collectively do this, because the regulators aren't going to want to have each one of us bring our own measure, and that's not going to scale. So there's a little bit of that kind of work that has to happen, which is difficult because right now the data is viewed as a competitive advantage potentially. So working out those types of things is all about the industry working it out themselves. Then it's the actual physicians. And I think this is where everybody in the digital world actually has to be a little bit sympathetic, because if you look at the false positive rates of some of the measures that are coming out of tech, you'll read the Mayo Clinic going, like, I have an 84% false positive rate with the Apple SpO2 thing. That's a terrible way to actually influence care change. So the industry that is behind doing the research, we have to get better at this, and we have to basically lead the way. And if you think the muscle, pharma basically is the research engine of healthcare. They know how to commercialize, that's one thing, but the main thing, if you look at their whole objective, is that they know how to build products that make a difference in people's lives. And so it's that engine that has to snap to and start fixing the measures, because they too know how to measure it. So I think that's when I think about it, when pharma embraces digital measures wholly, then everything else will work, because they're used to solving for disease level problems, they're used to influencing clinical practice, and they're used to basically getting this through the regulators. So everything that is sort of the historical muscle, when it solves this problem, will actually move the entire industry forward. That's an opinion statement.
I think we're seeing some of that already, right? So we have in the Innovative Medicines Initiative in the European Union, there's a 25 million euro program called Mobilized that we're participating in that is exactly about this: how to get regulators to accept digital endpoints, digital markers of mobility as something that they'll accept in a clinical trial. And it's a 5-year project just to get it to the point of submission. So this is kind of a long haul, but we have 10 industry sponsors. So there's lots of interest in this. I think your point is well taken. This is the way to make it forward. Sorry.
And I also want to say this is really the remit of Critical Path for Parkinson's. We also collaborate with Mobilized, but I will say it was really Ray Dorsey himself who kind of broke the mindset about and trying to get this field into open science. As you know, it's a pretty competitive area. And Mikki, I was reassured to hear your comments around the regulatory agencies kind of guiding the way, because in most of my interactions, people are saying it's the regulators who are posing a block here. But honestly, Ray and Biogen and Takeda partnered together on a really important observational study called WatchPD, looking at both at-home and in-clinic assessments in Parkinson's people right after diagnosis. And we have multiple different groups sharing the cost of that study with the regulatory agencies, FDA and EMA, pointing the way of what success looks like. We need to do more of this. The level of data sharing in this space is not where it needs to be to meet the urgency that patients are telling us. That's, to me, the biggest barrier to success in this space.
And just a quick reminder to those in our audience that we are going to open up the panel to questions at around 12:15 Eastern, so in about 10 minutes. So please, if you have any questions, you can type it into the question chat box and we will try to address those. So thank you for sending in those questions. We'd really love to be responsive to you. Ultimately, Ronenn, do you agree with Mikki that it's going to take pharma really embracing these digital measures, and if that happens, that if that domino falls, then much of this will come into place? And how much do you, a double-barreled question, so that's the first, do you agree with that argument that she makes, or that opinion that she has? And two, when you get together with people in the industry, are you all talking about this? How much are you talking about this?
So yes, absolutely. I think so. For example, we've put digital mobility assessments, or actually digital endpoints of some sort, into about 35 clinical trials in the last couple of years. And I think there are about 28 different endpoints being measured there. And I don't think we're very different from our competitors at other companies. What people have, I think, taken the point that this really has to be pre-competitive, because we get a much better response from regulators when we come as a group with academics and with patient advocacy groups and with industry people and say, look, we think this is important and we have a suggestion on how to do it. I think when people say, well, the regulators aren't helping, what they're doing is not lowering the standards, right? They're basically requiring the same level of proof from a digital marker that they expect from any other biomarker. And that's not easy, right? I mean, it takes years to get these things done. I think that in general, people are very much talking about it and people are experimenting, right? And there is this large number of small device companies that are putting things out. There's, of course, the larger and smaller pharma companies and biotechs that are working to try and make use of these things. And I don't think we're anywhere yet at the point of having a clear demonstration all the way. We've got basically, one digital endpoint approved by EMA and I think one by FDA, or maybe it's two. So we've got a long way to go, but it has been done for a few things, right? Walking kinetics for Duchenne muscular dystrophy is one. The proactive app for COPD is another. So there are a few of these, sort of intriguing successes, but it's not yet an easy path by any means.
And can I comment on this, Ronenn? I really liked how you started off, which is a kind of a testimony to my career of 30 years in industry of this funnel, right, from 90 to 95% to get to the home run across the finish line. But I will say what's really, I think, broken this barrier in diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are these global pre-competitive data sharing initiatives, these flagship public-private partnerships such as ADNI, the Alzheimer's Neuroimaging Initiative, and PPMI, funded by the Fox Foundation to mark and monitor progression and look at biomarkers. Those were successful for two reasons: to agree on consensus standards of how to collect the data, to allow harmonization of studies, but also to share the data broadly with the entire research community so that everybody can learn from the data. And I think if we can get to this space in the digital arena, we will see much faster progress. Lastly, I'll say everybody tells me, just like a surrogate, they want a digital endpoint, but using these tools for decision making at all stages of development, from preclinical to dose selection to identifying patients at risk or POC, would be fantastic.
Everybody, Diane, thank you. Everybody is nodding your head at what you just said. Let me kick it to Ray. Ray, why are you nodding your head vigorously in response to what Diane just said?
Because if we want better treatments, we need better measures. And let me just speak to neurology. 5.5 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease, and we have no highly effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease. None. 1.1 million Americans have Parkinson's disease, and the most effective treatment is 50 years old. Ronenn said 90% failure rates. In neurology, that's good. If we continue to evaluate new drugs for Parkinson's disease by having people tap their thumb and index finger and having people like me rate that on a categorical scale from 0 to 4, we're going to fail. If we continue to evaluate drugs for Alzheimer's disease by giving people a list of 5 words and seeing how many words they remember at the beginning and end of the study, we're going to fail. We need objective measures of the disease. Evidation did a study with Eli Lilly and Apple in which they deployed commercially available devices and found signatures of people with cognitive impairment that included activity, included how many texts a day they received, included how early they started their day. There are measures all around us to measure our health. We need to start using those measures so we can more efficiently and effectively evaluate new drugs, especially for neurological disorders, which are the leading source of disability in the world. Everyone on this call and everyone listening will be affected directly or indirectly by Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, and that's just 2 diseases. If we don't change the way in our approach to developing drugs for neurological diseases, we will all suffer the consequences.
And Ray, what if you were granted some great power here? What do you want to see happen tomorrow that is not happening today? And please be specific. What is it that you want to see drug makers do? What is it that you want to see tech giants like Apple or Google do? What is it that you want to see providers do? Again, that they are not doing today. What does this sort of more synthesized world look like?
I think there are digital measures that are available today that can evaluate whether a new intervention works or not. One simple one is number of steps per day. So I told you that in the setting of the COVID-19 pandemic, people's activity decreased. I told you in this setting of the Evidation study of mild cognitive impairment that activity is less among people with mild cognitive impairment. I think if we looked at activity, which is already approved for COPD, and applied it to a wide range of conditions, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, ALS, just within neurology alone, we could greatly accelerate therapeutic development and evaluation. There are tons of other things, gait speed, time spent at home, that we could be using. These measures, I think, have enormous face validity, cross a wide range of therapeutic areas, and we have great and effective ways of measuring them with very inexpensive devices today.
So here's a question. Are there examples where this is a question from the audience. Are there examples where understanding daily patient burden as a forcing function in developing better interventions?
I think I'll take that partially. When we think of better interventions, when you think of the idea, basically the issue around understanding what the data that are generated by an actual end consumer, the patient, what we're able to do is we're able to understand events. So in the sort of continuum, the holy grail in R&D side of in the research other half is this endpoint that replaces an in-clinic technician-driven endpoint. When we're looking at actual patient care, just the ability to understand that you are having an event or an exacerbation. So one of the publications I'll talk about is actually for Novartis with MS. So is it possible to understand that somebody's having a flare-up? Once you can understand the event, then you have the ability to look back at that and see perhaps was there a signal prior to the event that we could actually do a prediction. So in a lot of the work that's happening right now, it's using these tools so that they're not necessarily going to do the care, but what you get is you get a very objective package of data of your actual past year when you have a neurologist consult and you're not relying on patient memory. And that just helps in the actual caregiving. So that I think is sort of where we're at. We're not at the point yet where this data has been embraced to being able to do full virtual care. I think it's going to get there, but at least we're able to provide information to the specialist caring for that patient that gives them an objective data set as opposed to relying on that patient's memory. So I think that's where the shift is today. The better we get at that, the more we embrace that, the more I think it's just going to become standard of care.
Ronenn, do you agree?
Yes, I think that's right. I think, some of these things are, they're almost unique to each specific case. So it's very hard to kind of create a universal rule out of any of them, right? I think that's part of a problem. But I think that's probably about as close as we can get right now.
In a backgrounder, Mikki, that we had earlier this week, you talked about sort of having to cater to two different kinds of consumers. You have the buyers, the health systems, the physicians, and then you have the consumers. Can you talk us through that, what the differences are and what the challenges there represent, and how to talk to both of those groups?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually one of the most interesting problems when you look at the industry itself. So you sort of look at pharma. Pharma has a customer and a consumer, and they're not the same person. And the language that the customer speaks is very different to what the consumer speaks. And so if you think about the way that we do healthcare, it's an evidence-based business. We have to be. We're talking about people's lives. So everything that we do when we're trying to influence clinical practice, or we're trying to get them to engage in new tools or trends, it has to be on an evidence-driven basis. So clinical, very scientifically understood frameworks, not a lot of nuance, and definitely no squishy stuff. On the other side, the actual consumer, is feeling a little anxious, they have a disease that they're dealing with, it is a part of their life, it's not their whole life, which in the pharma person that's in that the physician's that's specialty, they're a specialist in that area. These people have lives, they have kids, they have school, and they have a disease. And somewhere in that continuum, it's there. So the type of language and the way that you engage and the frequency and tone and everything else has to be completely different. And those worlds have to meet right now, because if you just look pure commercial side, we leave the sort of research side and we go to the commercial side of pharma. The biggest issue that you have is that the trend is away from seeing reps or going to conferences. You know, we had 10 years ago, we had the Sunshine Act, everything's happened. So all of a sudden, the sales model that used to help shape clinical practice is gone. So there's a huge imperative for pharma to rethink how it does it and have to get to the patient to influence the patient and educate the patient to influence care. But that means they literally have to learn a new language, because that isn't how their entire sales language is all about evidence. So those two worlds really have to start coming together in a way where direct to patient has to generate evidence so that you can actually get the physicians to adopt it. So you have to run this, Google translates continuously between those two worlds.
Have you seen anyone start, oh, excuse me, have you started to see anyone do this effectively?
Not well. There are definitely trends towards it, I would say. I think there is a huge intent. So there's a few of the really large groups that are starting to head that direction. I would posit that Heartline is a very good example of going, wait a second, I'm going to take marketing dollars, influence a huge amount of people, build a measure that physicians will believe, because we've got a false positive rate on the actual AFib measure, and then have absolute reach. So it's an interesting blend, because it's taking what would be considered marketing dollars, putting it into a medical diagnostic, which will eventually be on the wrist of every consumer. And very, very smart marketing, but also just really, really good holistically for human health.
We've got another question from the audience here. And whoever sort of wants to jump at this, please do. Beyond measures of efficacy, what are examples of early detection, optimal management via personalized intervention and prediction/prevention?
Ray highlighted Alzheimer's and Parkinson's due to the unmet need and urgency here. In both those diseases, you know, the promising insights in the science is really illuminating novel potential medications that will help halt the disease progression with advances in genetics, especially gene-based therapeutics, right? And in both those diseases, the pathway has really been illuminated by looking at risk genes to identify individuals at risk that can go into trials that ultimately will enable prevention. So far, the genetics field has really embraced this idea of open data science and sharing to allow this kind of data to illuminate new targets and identification of patients. This is really not yet happening, in my view, in the area of digital medicine, right? We need to identify and find these individuals at risk. And people with Parkinson's manifest many aspects of this disease, particularly in the non-motor sphere, in years before the onset of true clinical diagnosis. They oftentimes go to many doctors for many years to be told they truly have Parkinson's. So again, we really are in a time where we can envision what success looks like in precision medicine and promising treatments for prevention, but we need to identify those individuals. Genetics is paving the way, but digital medicine has huge potential here, and we can get there, but only with more data sharing, because it's been, to date, in my view, pretty hard to get people to be excited and share, incentivized to share data in this space.
Well, we've seen approved therapeutics that are digital apps, right? Pear, for example, for opioid use disorder or insomnia, things like that. So this is another piece of the ice that's cracking, right? Where you can start to see that the people accept it, and actually there's a funding mechanism for it. There's a insurance-based payment for it. So that's the reality of how you get these things, right? And so I think that the direction, as you said, Diane, is the right one.
Ray, what were you going to say, please?
These cracks portend a future that's much different than the present. It's not going to be too far into the future where a watch, a smartwatch, or a smartphone is going to be able to determine that you may have Parkinson's disease, likely based on passive assessments. That information, that afferent, that information coming in, could then be communicated back out to individuals who have these devices and tell them maybe you should see a clinician for evaluation. Even better, here is a clinician that you can see, and you can press this button right now and be seen by them. The Apple Heart study, started to do this for atrial fibrillation a little bit. 400,000 people enrolled in 8 months by going directly to consumers to detect atrial fibrillation, and when identified, got a telemedicine appointment with a physician to be evaluated for their atrial fibrillation. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future, and that the idea that the best way to assess health is by going to your doctor every year is going to be quickly supplanted by wearable devices that we all use all the time to measure other things that will now be used to measure health.
And Mikki, this is also something that we talked about in our backgrounder. Google and Apple and some of these other tech companies, they're really aggressively going after this data. What's the consequence there, do you think, for drug makers, medical device manufacturers? What happens as data becomes more and more valuable, and you've got these sort of non-traditional healthcare players getting deep into this market?
Yeah, I think when you look at them, the key there is that there is a distribution model that's going to allow them to put a toll gate in front of all of the innovation that pharma is really generating. So I think when we think about this market, we have to understand that those people understand what the last mile value is, and all of the efforts that they're doing now to understand it is where can they actually put these toll gates, and then how much value can they extract from those tolls, and then leave some of the rest. So when you're looking at these markets, I think people go, oh, Apple's going to disrupt the healthcare market and it's going to change forever. And then everybody feels comfortable in the healthcare market because they go, oh, that will never work. But what they're not seeing is that it will work just enough to get a few $1 billion in revenue a year away from pharma. And so I think it's those types of things that are happening in the market where people look at it and think it's an all or nothing game, but it's selling the shovels, the old adage. So I think that's the way, when I look at those guys, they're very good at it. That's where I see them coming back in and exacting a price for both data access and for participant access.
And Ronenn, when you and other executives in pharma have conversations, does Apple come up? Does Google come up? Do you think about this? And is that sort of spurring, this one of the themes of this conversation has been a level of urgency here. From a business standpoint, do you think that drug makers see this urgency and feel a need to move quicker in order to perhaps minimize tech companies' involvement in this, or their profits in this?
Well, I think for us, we have relationships with all of these companies because of this exact situation. And part of it is that the skill sets are so different, right? I mean, the stuff that they can do, we can't. And when we start talking about a regulated process, it's their eyes glaze over, right? So there's obviously a potential synergy between the two, and that's how we look at it. It's who are you going to partner with for what particular process? And I think it's going to be, sort of like baseball, where teams that may or may not get along very well will trade players for the right reasons. And I think we're going to see that. It's not always Red Sox and Yankees.
We've got just a quick note to our audience. We've got 5 minutes. We've got another question here. Diane, I think this perhaps it might be directed to you, at least at first pass. What concerns do patients have around sharing wearable data? Are they worried about being told they are, quote unquote, at risk? How do we build trust?
That's a really great question. And again, I look to Ray here as a pioneer many years ago who really took the leap of faith by developing this Empower app that went out to 10,000 people with Parkinson's. And so the rate in which they agreed upon entry into the app to consent their data is game changing. We've never seen this before, right? People with Parkinson's want their data to be shared. Obviously, there are concerns around security, privacy. But if you look at the dynamic of what's happening in the world now and people sharing their data in platforms, social media, and other forums, to me, the concern about privacy is being so inflated that it's stopping progress. It's one of the barriers that's making this way harder than it has to be. And I continue to hear about concerns about privacy, risks for sharing, security issues are clearly stumbling blocks, and it's slowing things down. So I think we need to get together with the legal people of the concerns with patients and say, how are we protecting your privacy? And is it a real risk, right? And unpeel that onion so that we can make this happen faster, because it's a huge issue right now.
And it shouldn't be. That's the amazing thing. It's the wrong people are making it an issue. I think Evidation has proven. We have over 4 million people connected, sharing their data with us. We've been running for a decade. We do a lot of research. We've had more than 1.2 million people through bespoke research sharing this data. What the end individuals want to know is, don't abuse my data, don't sell it out the back door. Please, when you're using it, do good for me, because I am really struggling with my own condition. And they will very happily, as long as you keep their trust, share data with you. And so what's happening is we're allowing lawyers to have arguments about what privacy should be, because they're speaking for the patient. Let the patient speak for themselves. We've got ample proof that if you're going to do good for me, I am going to share as much as I can, because I would like to be better. So I think that sort of as an answer to that, I think that everybody in this space has to tune down the lawyers and tune up the patient, because I think we'll find out that it doesn't matter that much.
Ray?
So just a couple caveats. I think in large part depends on who the participant is. Most people want to participate in research. I think their views differ if they have the disease or they don't. So in Parkinson's disease, I remember asking someone with telemedicine, what do you think about privacy concerns? She goes, I don't care what you do. You can put me on YouTube, just provide me care. And then there are a large segment of the population that is very delighted to participate in this research, especially if research results are communicated back to them like Evidation does, or used to advance therapies. But there are people who don't have health insurance, who don't have access to health care, who are been historically discriminated against, are discriminated against, and will be discriminated against in the future. And I think those individuals have deep concerns, because people like me have not been trustworthy in the past. And quite frankly, we're probably still not trustworthy. And one thing that we can do is empower participants so they don't need to be in the position of trusting, but that they control the data, that they see exactly who accesses their data and for what purposes. There is too much selling of data occurring through third parties, and absent of people's consent, that's being sold on marketplaces throughout this country. Right now, people's health data are being bought and sold by third parties who have no direct role in providing care. That action needs to stop. We need to empower participants so they know exactly who's using their data and exactly for what purposes. There are models in place like Evidation, like the work that the Critical Path Institute is, but we should not be so naive as to not think that other parties will use this information for purposes that have nothing to do with improving the health of individuals, especially those who've been discriminated against, and not to use it for their bottom line. Yes,
hear, hear. That is absolutely the case. And I think when you're looking at the types of ways, and the laws are changing anyway, because we've got the California law and we've got the European laws, so that people do control their own data. But I do think it's like, if it's not patient-mediated access to their own data, we shouldn't be using it because at some point that's got to stop. So ask them every time and never use it if they say no. That's just the right approach.
This has been a great conversation. We are at time. We started a couple minutes late, so I'm just going to ask everybody on the panel for 1 or 2 wrap-up sentences with the idea that we want to leave this audience thinking about something and how to help bring this movement, this tech forward. So with that, I'm going to start, Ronenn, with you. What are 1 or 2 sentences that you have for the audience so that you want them to be thinking about in the coming days, weeks, months?
I think that the stage we're at for making the next leap with these kinds of opportunities is still pre-competitive, and it's still really about creating the partnerships and consortia that can make common ground and develop the baseline technical feasibility that we need. I think that's where we are, and that would be the challenge for the next few years.
Diane?
Yes, music to my ears, Ronenn. That's what keeps me up at night and what I do day in and day out for the sake of urgency for patients. I would say this field really needs to up our game in terms of what's defining pre-competitive and bring this field into open science for the sake of the patients. Patients also need to understand that by sharing their data, we're going to minimize duplication of effort and make this whole process faster. And I think it's just a matter of doing what we said today, bringing all the stakeholders together to not just talk about it and not just make roadmaps, but share data, because that's what the regulatory agencies and everybody needs to bring these tools to the finish line.
Ray?
We now have the tools and technologies to allow anyone, anywhere to receive care and to participate in research. If we fail to do that, that's on us.
Mikki?
And there are, the digital biomarker is the end result. There are plenty of measures that get created on the way to that digital biomarker that are going to be incredibly useful for engaging patients and giving better care. Don't let perfect get in the way of very good.
Very good. With that, I will, on behalf of Evidation, thank you to those of you in the audience for participating in this conversation, and thank you to our panelists for giving your time and your insight and, frankly, clearly your devotion and passion to this issue. Thanks very much, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.